Well, our keynote speaker is Dr. Ben Carson. Dr. Benjamin S. Carson, MD, is founder and chairman of the American Cornerstone Institute, and I like what he calls it. He calls it a new think tank, do tank. I love that because we have plenty of think tanks that think but don't do. So it's a think tank, do tank, whose mission is to promote the 4 founding principles which are the cornerstones of our country: faith, liberty, community, and life, as well as to pursue common sense solutions that challenge conventional groupthink. He most recently served as the 17th Secretary of the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. For nearly 30 years, Secretary Carson served as Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at the Johns Hopkins Children's Center, a position he assumed when he was just 33 years old, becoming the youngest major division director in the hospital's history. In 1987, he successfully performed the first separation of craniopagus twins, conjoined at the back of the head. Dr. Carson received dozens of honors and awards in recognition of his achievements, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. He has also been awarded over 70 honorary doctorate degrees. He's authored 9 books, 4 of which he co-wrote with his wife, Candy. That's impressive. That is impressive. Number 10 is coming out in May. Fantastic. Well, Dr. Carson and his wife co-founded the Carson Scholars Fund, which recognizes young people of all backgrounds of exceptional academic and humanitarian accomplishments. The fund is currently operating in 50 states and the District of Columbia, and this year is celebrating its 25th anniversary of the first awards ceremony. In honor of that, the organization has now awarded, wait for it, a total of more than 10,000 scholars, as well as more than $8 million in scholarships. Before the end of this year, yeah, that is fantastic. Before the end of this year, the Carson Scholars will have installed more than 250 Ben Carson reading rooms around the country. What a great idea that is. Born in Detroit to a single mother with a 3rd grade education who worked multiple jobs to support their family, Secretary Carson was raised to love reading and education. He graduated from Yale University and earned his MD degree from the University of Michigan Medical School. He and his wife are the proud parents of 3 adult sons and 6 grandchildren. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my great privilege to introduce our keynote speaker tonight, Dr. Ben Carson.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. Well, Candy and I are absolutely delighted to be here, and grateful to our friend, Dr. Carol Swain, for putting this together, and for all of you for being here and recognizing that America is an exceptional place. And the emphasis on the American dream is something we need to begin to really take notice of once again. You know, there are those who are trying to tell us that there is no such thing as American exceptionalism. They're trying to tell us that we have a country that is defective, that is systemically racist. If our country was all that bad, why would people be forming caravans trying to get in here? That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And there are those who want you not to believe your eyes, but just to believe what they're telling you. And that's a problem. Now, I have to make a confession. Everybody gives disclaimers this day. And I have a disclaimer too. And that is, I'm not politically correct. And I never try to offend people. I don't think that's a nice thing to do. But some people get offended at anything. So even though I don't want to offend anybody, if anybody is offended, too bad. One of the things that we really concentrate on with American Cornerstone is freedom, liberty. That includes freedom of speech. And there are those who say that that's not threatened in our country because the government is not restricting people's speech. But the fact of the matter is, if big tech and media restricts your speech and cancels you and punishes you, and the government is complicit, it is exactly the same thing as the government restricting our speech. And we need to understand that. But it's also very important that the reasonable people, the logical people, the God-fearing people in our country do not act like those who are on the other side. We can't allow ourselves to be dragged into the mud. We must encourage conversation. And one of the problems with the people who are logical thinkers is they frequently lack courage. And they just stand in the corner with their head down and hope that nobody calls them a nasty name. We can't do that anymore. There's too much at stake. We're talking about our young people and their future. And somebody has to fight for them. We can't expect just a few people to carry that banner. That is so critical. And we need to promote the ideal that it's okay to disagree. If two people think the same way about everything, one of them isn't necessary. That's why God gave us brains. We all have different experiences, and obviously we're going to think different things. It's okay. And we can't let the forces of division and hatred prevail by making us think that we're enemies. You can take the most radical left-wing person and the most radical right-wing person in this country, and they're going to agree on 90% of stuff. But the haters take that 10% that they don't agree on, and they massage that, and they try to make that into the biggest factor in our lives. We must be smart enough to resist that and recognize that all of this animosity that's going on right now is intentional. You may remember, some of you who are old enough, Nikita Khrushchev, and how he said to Dwight Eisenhower, your grandchildren's children will live under communism, and we will never have to fire a shot. What did he know? He knew that in order to change this country, you weren't going to win a physical war, but that all you had to do is gain control of the educational system so that you could indoctrinate the children. And people have known that forever. You can go back to the Bible. Proverbs 22:6, what does it say? Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he's old, he'll not depart from it. And, Vladimir Lenin said, give me your children to teach for 4 years, and the seed that I plant will never be uprooted. people have known forever the importance of indoctrination of young people. Khrushchev also knew that you had to gain control of the media so that you could spoon-feed the population only those things you wanted them to know, and you could shield them from the things that you didn't want them to know. And he knew you had to replace trust in God with trust in government. And he recognized that if you drive the national debt to such levels, astronomical levels, you could then justify massive taxation, redistribution of wealth, and total dependence on the government. Does any of that sound familiar? This is all the stuff that's going on right now. And it's going to be necessary for people to talk about this. You can't just say, yeah, that's terrible that that's happening. What's on TV tonight, you know? You really cannot take that attitude. This has got to be something that's very serious for every single one of us. And, you know, America, we're being taught, or our kids are being taught in school, is a horrible place because of slavery. Now, we have had our problems, like every other nation, because we've been inhabited by people. It's a problem. People are not perfect. People make mistakes. All people do. That's why we need a savior, quite frankly. But I got to tell you something about slavery. Slavery's been around since there have been civilizations. You know, you look in the Bible. You know, Abraham's seed, they were made slaves in Egypt. It was a horrible situation, and they needed to be delivered. And there are many other mentions of it. And you look throughout societies in history, slavery has existed. So there is nothing unique about the United States in that we had slavery. There is something unique, though, about us. And that is, we had so many people who were vehemently opposed to slavery that we were willing to fight a civil war and lose a large portion of our population to stop it. That's what we need to make sure that our children understand about this nation. They also need to understand that because of a person's skin color, you cannot associate them with slave ownership. The majority of people in the South did not own slaves, white people. That was for the aristocrats. That was not for everybody. And there were black slave owners as well. Interestingly enough, if you go back and you really look through the records, you will find that in 1670, the House of Burgess in the Commonwealth of Virginia made a declaration that blacks and Indians could not own Christian slaves, which was their euphemism for white slaves, because some owned them. So whether you owned a slave or whether you were a slave, it's not a matter of a particular race. It's a matter of whether you have an advantage. And people have had advantages throughout history, and they have used those advantages to hurt other people. And that happens in all races. Where do you think the slaves came from? Believe me, it wasn't the fact that the Spaniards and the Portuguese were able to go into the jungle and grab these people. Believe me, they would not have been able to do that. It was because the tribes were having wars, and frequently, if they didn't kill their opponents, they took them as slaves. And then they found out, wow, we can sell these people and get all kinds of goodies. That's how it happened. So there's plenty of guilt to go around. It doesn't have to all reside in one place. But then you have to really stop and think about how much progress has been made in this country in terms of race just in my lifetime. I remember as a 6-year-old seeing whites and colored signs here in Tennessee. But I also remember as a youngster when a black person came on television in a non-servile role, and everybody called everybody into the living room to see it. It was so exciting. Come and see this. And now you have black generals and admirals and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and university presidents, even Ivy League schools. We've had a black president elected twice. We have a black vice president, sort of. The point being that even though some people don't want to admit it, the landscape has changed drastically. And we've made enormous progress, but now we have people who are trying to convince everybody that we haven't made any progress and that we have this evil society that exists. And we have to be willing to speak up and tell them about the things that are going on. Also, we need to recognize that this country is an enormously great place because we've had a lot of enormously talented people. And they've come from all backgrounds. You know, we look at some people say that young black male is an endangered species in America because there are more young black males in the penal system than there are in higher education system. And it's true. But what happened? We've allowed a situation to occur and we have not really devoted much attention to it. And we've actually had policies promoted by our government that have destroyed the black family. And 70 to 80% of those young black males grow up in a home that has no father. No authority figure in some cases. Now, that wasn't my case because my mother was an authority figure. But in most cases, they're not like my mother was. And sometimes the first authority figure they run into is either a police officer or someone in the neighborhood who's better than they are. In either case, it doesn't work out well. Frequently, they end up in the penal system, which becomes a university for more crime. And now, when we have these various district attorneys and people who don't even want to prosecute crimes, then that university becomes even more powerful, more effective in our society, all of which is adding to the perception that we have a system that doesn't work. These are things that is very important for people to understand. But, you know, those young black boys, we all need to be interested in their welfare. And anybody could take that 6-year-old young black male and take a walk down the streets of Nashville and give him a black history lesson he would never forget. You could start by pointing to his shoes and saying it was John Matzliger, a black man who invented the automatic shoe lasting machine which revolutionized the shoe industry throughout the world. And then you step on that clean street and you tell them it was Charles Brooks, a black man who invented the street sweeper, those machines with the big brushes. And down that street comes a big refrigerated tractor trailer truck. Tell them it was Frederick Jones, a black man who invented the refrigeration system for trucks, later adopted for airplanes, trains, boats. and it comes to a stop at the red light, you can tell it was Garrett Morgan, a black man who invented the traffic signal. And you can also tell how he invented the gas mask, saved lots of lives during the war. While you're talking about the war, Henrietta Bradbury, a black woman who invented the underwater cannon, made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarines. And while you're talking about black women, you'll see a beautiful black woman walking down the street. A black man did not invent her. But you can use that opportunity to talk about Madam C.J. Walker, a black woman who invented cosmetic products for women of dark complexion, was the first woman of any nationality to become a millionaire on her own efforts. And then you will walk past the hospital, and you can talk about Charles Drew and his contributions to blood banking, understanding of the function of blood plasma. Daniel Hale Williams, the first successful open heart surgery in the world, had an operative mortality rate of less than 1.5%. You look up at the surgical light, Thomas Edison. You didn't know he was black, did you? Well, he wasn't. But his right-hand man, Lewis Latimer, was. And you can tell how Lewis Latimer came up with the filament that made the light bulb work for more than 2 or 3 days, invented the electric lamp diagram, the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell, was a tremendous inventor in his own right. Most people have never heard of him. And you'll walk past the railroad tracks and you can talk about Andrew Beard, black man, invented the automatic railroad car coupler, spurred on the Industrial Revolution. Elijah McCoy, the automatic lubrication system for locomotive engines. He had so many great inventions. People were always saying, is that a McCoy? Is that the real McCoy? You got people like David Duke talking about the real McCoy, don't even know who they're paying homage to. And I'm just barely scratching the surface. But you know what's important about America? Is I could take that same walk down the street for virtually any nationality in this country and point out tremendous contributions, because our diversity is not a problem, it is a strength. And these people who are pushing policies that are antithetical to Dr. King's dream, what are they trying to do? They are trying to make people act like animals. Now, let me tell you what I'm talking about. If you look at the human brain and you put that next to an animal's brain, let's take a dog, for instance. The animal's brain will have a very well-developed midbrain, because the midbrain allows you to react. So you see things, you hear things, you react to them very quickly. The human brain is not that well developed in the midbrain, but it has huge frontal lobes. Those allow you to process information, actual intellectual functioning, grasp information from the past and the present, project it into a plan, assess a situation. In other words, to be able to judge somebody by the content of their character and not the color of their skin. They want us and they want our children to act like animals and just look at the color of someone's skin. How utterly ridiculous. And as a neurosurgeon, when I would take someone to the operating room and cut that scalp and peel it back and take off that bone flap, I would be actually operating on the thing that makes that person who they are. It's not the hair, it's not the skin, it is the brain that makes you who you are. We need to begin to emphasize that. We need to act like human beings and not like animals, and not allow ourselves to be manipulated the way they are. And that's such an important concept. The American dream. Why does everyone want to come here? Why is this the destination place? Well, you know, as a youngster, when I was 9 years old, I remember sitting on the ghetto stairs in Boston. We had moved from Detroit to Boston after my parents got divorced. And I was looking through the building across the street, through which a sunbeam was shining. All the windows had been broken out. And I saw that sunbeam, and it made me think about my future. And I remember distinctly thinking that I probably would not live to be more than 20 or 25 years old. Why? Because that's what I saw around me. Both of my favorite older cousins had been killed. It's just the way it was. But my mother had a different thinking than most of the people around her. People were always talking about how the system was against you and how you couldn't succeed. My mother was always saying, if anybody can do anything, you can do it too, except you can do it better. She was constantly the cheerleader. And we moved back to Detroit, and I was a terrible student. I was the worst student you've ever seen. I remember once we were having an argument in the schoolyard about who was the dumbest kid in the school. It wasn't a big argument. Everybody agreed it was me. But then someone tried to extend the argument to who was the dumbest person in the world. And I said, but there are billions of people in the world. And they said, yep, and you're the dumbest one. Well, to make matters worse, after recess, we went back in the classroom and we had a math quiz. Now, I had a basic philosophical disagreement with the math teacher who thought you need to know your timetables. And since in those days they were printed on the back of the little notebooks, I said, I don't need to learn these. I can look them up anytime I want. Well, it didn't work on the test. And you had to pass your test paper to the person behind you. They would correct it. And then the teacher would call your name, and you had to report your score out loud. Not a problem if you got 100 or a 95 or a 90. Major problem if you got a 0 and just had an argument about who was the dumbest person in the world. So I started scheming. I said, I know what, when the teacher calls my name, I'll mumble. And the teacher will think I said one thing, and the girl behind me will think I said something else. So I said, yeah. She said, 9. Benjamin, you got 9 right? This is wonderful. I knew you could do it if you just applied yourself. Class, this is a great day. Benjamin has got 9. Finally, the girl behind me couldn't take it any longer. And she stood up and said, he said none. Well, the kids were rolling in the aisles, and if I could have disappeared into thin air, never to be heard from again in the history of the world, I would gladly have done so. But I couldn't. So I had to act like it didn't bother me. But it did. It bothered me a lot. Not enough to make me study, but it bothered me a lot. But it was my mother. My mother said that she was a domestic, and she cleaned other people's houses, and she went from one house to the next. She was leaving 5 in the morning, get back at midnight, because she didn't like the idea of welfare. But she was actually a spy, because she said, these people live in these beautiful homes, they're doing so well, I want to know what they're doing. And she finally concluded it was because they were always reading books. They weren't always watching TV, so she came home and imposed that on us. And we were not happy campers. In today's world, we would have called social services on her. But she said we had to read books, turn off the TV set. And I hated it in the beginning, but after a while, I actually began to enjoy reading those books. I read about explorers and scientists and surgeons and entrepreneurs, and I began to realize, the more of these stories I read, that the person who has the most to do with what happens to you in life is you. It's not somebody else. Nobody else can get in your way unless you let them get in your way. Completely changed my way of thinking. And you know, my mother's friends just criticized her like crazy. But she got the last laugh because one son became a brain surgeon and the other became a rocket scientist. So she obviously knew what she was doing. But that dream, that American dream, it's available for anybody in our society. And the reason that America is the destination for so many people around the world is because they know that. And you have probably noticed that a lot of people who come here, take for instance, a few decades ago, the Vietnamese boat people. Did you notice how they would be out in front of the 7-Eleven sweeping? And then they'd be pumping the gas. And then they'd be behind the cash register. And then they would own the place. People come here and they see these incredible opportunities. But we somehow sometimes convince our people that those opportunities don't exist. If you think you're a victim, you are a victim. And that's why critical race theory is such a bad idea, because it teaches minority kids that they are victims, that no matter what happens, you can't get a fair shake. You can't, and that is completely untrue. And it teaches the white kids that you should feel guilty, that you and your relatives are oppressors. So what do you have? A combination of white guilt and minority victimhood. And it leads to some of the most absurd policy making that you can possibly imagine. And we're seeing the results of that. And that's why it becomes so important for us to push back against those kinds of things and have the right kind of education. And one of the things that we're doing at American Cornerstone is advancing our Little Patriots program. littlepatriots.com. You can go there. And we have a K through 5 education program that gives the true history of America, warts and all, but kids will come away from it feeling great. There's a little guide called Liberty Eagle. It's our symbol. Liberty Eagle has a right wing and a left wing. The Liberty Eagle cannot fly with 2 right wings, cannot fly with 2 left wings. But we need to begin to teach our children the concept of working together. We're called the United States of America. That's what makes us strong. We're too strong to be destroyed by China or Russia or North Korea or Iran, but we can be destroyed from within. Jesus said at first, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." Abraham Lincoln echoed it again. It is absolutely true. But what happens when we unite? Now, one of the dangers that we must be cognizant of, things are going to change in this country. People are waking up in droves on both sides of the aisle. And there's going to be a massive shift of power. I think that's a pretty safe prediction. It is critical that when that occurs, those of us who are logical don't try to do the same things back. You can't do that. Instead, we must get back to some of our founding principles, like faith. Faith teaches us to love our neighbor, not to hate our neighbor, not to cancel our neighbor if they disagree with us, but to love our neighbor. Liberty, freedom, freedom of speech, freedom of religion. We must not tell people that you can't talk about God in public, that you can't talk about God in our schools. That's not who we are. You know, this country was founded on Judeo-Christian values and principles. We used to have in our history books stories about the Bulletproof Washington. You know, George Washington was a courier for General Braddock during the French and Indian War. And the couriers riding back and forth with people being shot at. All the couriers were killed, except for Washington, who had his horse shot out from underneath him, who had 4 bullet holes in his coat, who had bullet fragments in his hair, but no wounds. And years later, after the war, still before he became president, but he was quite prominent at the time, he was back in the area, and one of the Indian chiefs who had been involved in that war, he was elderly and about to die. He said, "Please take me, I must see this man." And when he saw General Washington, he said, "Sir, I wanted to meet you because I'm an expert marksman, and I shot you many times. And my men shot you many times, and I just wanted, before I died, to see the man who was protected by the Great Spirit above." You know, that used to be in our history books. And there are many other amazing stories that tell you that God, providence, played a very vital role in the creation of this country. And we should not get away from those godly principles. And there is a philosophy that I've put forth that I think will lead to success in life for anyone. It's called Think Big. Each one of those letters means something special. The T is for talent, which God gave to every single person, not just the ability to sing and dance and throw a ball. Nothing wrong with those things. But intellectual talent. Do you realize that over the last 100+ years, over 90% of the world-changing inventions came from this country? Because we had an atmosphere that encouraged entrepreneurship and innovative thinking. We need to get back to that again. All of this one-size-fits-all stuff, that is not American. And that goes for the way we treat viruses, too. You know? I mean, don't get me started on COVID. It is absolutely absurd. But, you know, here's what's interesting about it. God is fixing the problem regardless of how stupid our policies are. You'll notice the virus is getting weaker and weaker, even though it's spreading more easily, which means pretty soon just about everyone will have it, and we'll have immunity, we'll have natural immunity. So it doesn't matter how stupid they keep being, it doesn't matter, we're still going to conquer this, thanks to God. Yeah. The H is for honesty. Lead a clean and honest life. Don't put skeletons in the closet, they won't come back to haunt you. Just when you don't want to see them. And what a difference that makes in the way that you can do things. I remember one day I was operating and a phone call comes into the operating room. Nurse holds the phone up to my ear and I'm told that the state of Florida is trying to attach my wages for child support. I said, "What?" I said, "I have 3 children. I support them very well." And they said, "No, there's a woman in Florida who says you are the father of her son. And she knows where you went to high school, college, medical school, even has a picture of you in scrubs." So on the basis of that, they're pursuing a paternity suit. And then it escalated. I had to get my lawyer involved. And they said, send us a blood specimen so we can do DNA testing. And I said, what? If I send you a blood specimen, it's going to end up at a murder scene and I'll be in jail for the rest of my life. But it escalated a bit, and then it just fizzled away, just died. Because what happens is, a lot of times they see people who are out and about all the time. They figure they've been messing around. They don't even know all the people they've been messing around with, so they should be easy targets. But I had one major advantage. I knew that the only woman I had ever slept with was my wife. I didn't have to scratch my head and say, was there some conference in Tennessee? I didn't have to do that. So, clean, honest life really uncomplicates your life. The I is for insight, which comes from listening to people who've already gone where you're trying to go, learn from their triumphs and learn from their mistakes. A wise person can learn from someone else's mistakes. A stupid person has to make them all themselves. The N is for nice. Be nice to people. Because once they get over the suspicion of why you're being nice, they'll be nice to you. You get so much more done when they're being nice. And just try it. Try in this next week to intentionally look for people that you don't normally talk to and that you are not nice to and that you ignore, and go out of your way to be nice to them. It's fun. It really is. And the reactions that you will get in many cases will be quite amazing. And you'll make some new friends. And can you imagine what kind of a society we could have if people just started thinking about others more than themselves? We can do this. It's part of who we are as Americans. The K is for knowledge, which makes you into a more valuable person. The more of it you have, the more valuable you become. The B is for books, which is the mechanism for getting that knowledge. And it's never too late. My mother had less than a third grade education, but she got her GED. She went on to college. In 1994, she got an honorary doctorate degree. So she was Dr. Carson, too. The second I is for in-depth learning, learning for the sake of knowledge and understanding as opposed to superficial learners. And the G is the most important letter for God. Why do people criticize public officials who talk about God and say that somehow we're violating separation of church and state, which is not mentioned in the Constitution, by the way. There's no reason that you have to separate your faith in God from the way that you live. And we need to make that clear to everybody these days. Godly principles of loving your neighbor, of caring about those who cannot care for themselves, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, having values and principles that guide your life. Those are the things that made America into a great country. That's why we were able to rise from a ragtag bunch of militiamen to the pinnacle of the world in record time. That's why we were able to change the course of the world during World War II. Think about D-Day. And those young men, many of them only 17 or 18 years old, invading the beaches of Normandy, being mowed down by machine gun fire, hundreds of bodies, 1,000 bodies laying dead on the beach. Were the others frightened? Did they turn back? Yes, they were frightened, but they did not turn back. They stepped over those bodies and they overwhelmed the Axis forces, knowing in many cases that they would never see their loved ones again. They would never see their homeland again. They didn't do it for themselves. They did it for us, so that we could live in peace and freedom. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is our turn to do it for those who are coming after us. Thank you very much.